Okay.
Okay, I'm coming in now.
Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure to get together to learn some Torah together. I'd like to start off with just making a dedication. The Shiur have been sponsored by Graham and Belinda Calvert, Ilu Neshama of David ben Yitzchak and Yisrael Leib ben Yehuda Halevi, and in honor of the grandchildren, the Calverts, the Chonins, Schneiders, and the Wosners. Kain Yirbu. Should have lots of nachas from your grandchildren and from all your family. Okay, we are now on the third shiur of our series of 4 shiurim for Seder night. Just to remind you, the first shiur we looked at the two aspects, the two dimensions of the mitzvah of matzah. One is lechem oni, and one is lechem geula. That in a sense, the matzah has got both of these aspects to it, and I connected it to the first kazayas at the beginning of the meal, where we say hol lachma anya. That really represents the bread eaten in poverty, and the matzah at the end of the meal is like Rabbi Gamliel says, matzah zu she'anu ochlin. Why do we eat the matzah? Because Hashem shenigalu, it's the matzah of the geula. And in actual fact, I mentioned also that the Mepharshim say that the matzah is referred to in the Zohar as the Nahama Dehemnusa, meaning the bread of Emunah. And in that context, both of these eatings of the matzah are really representing something very important, that Klal Yisrael succeeded in preserving, that we succeeded in preserving our emunah, both in times of persecution and in times of affluence and freedom, and that both situations present a nisayon, or a test for our emunah. In actual fact, in that sense, the concluding idea was that the matzah is a symbol of what you might call spiritual resilience. In other words, the ability of Klal Yisrael to be resilient against persecution, and also in the face of freedom and affluence, to be able to maintain our emunah. And this is really the story of the matzah. That's what we dealt with in the first shiur. In the second shiur, we looked at Rabbi Akiva in the Haggadah and what was unique about him. And today I want to have a look a bit more closely at the Arba Kosos, the 4 cups of wine, and the way that they connect in a very fascinating way to the matzahs and the Seder night. I would say that really in terms of the way Chazal, if you like, designed the Seder nights, the 2 main pillars of the evening revolve around the matzah on the one hand and the Arba Kosos, the 4 cups of wine, on the other. These are the 2 main activities, if you like, which support the whole reading of the Haggadah and the discussing of the material of the Haggadah. But those are the 2 practical mitzvahs. What's interesting is to have a bit of a closer look at these mitzvahs and what they symbolize and how we can understand them maybe on a slightly a deeper level. Let's focus for the first few minutes of the shiur on the Arba Kosos, on the 4 cups of wine. And I'm sure over the years at the Sidorim, you hear the kids and people at the Seder table speaking about the symbolism of the Arba Kosos. Interestingly, the Gemara itself doesn't tell us the meaning of the Arba Kosos. We are given 4 cups of wine simply for halachic reasons. What are the halachic reasons? That we have 4 brachas. We have 4 brachas, and each bracha has to be said al hayayin. The first one is Kiddush. The second one is Asher Go'alanu B'Golas Avosenu, the concluding bracha of the Magid, of the Haggadah. And then we have the bracha of Birkas Hamazon, and then we have the bracha of Hallel. So these are the 4 brachas, and each one of them has to be done al hakos. And that is simply the way the Gemara and the Halacha describes for us the drinking of the Arba Kosas. I mentioned to you last time that it's recommended for some people who are not accustomed to drinking a lot of wine should stick to grape juice because the mitzvah of the evening is Sipur Yetzias Mitzrayim, is to be able to focus and discuss and learn and understand the Haggadah and internalize the message of the Haggadah. And you can't do that if you are under the influence, if you're a little bit, if the wine has somewhat made you a bit drowsy. So, but let's have a closer look at the Arba Kosas. The first thing everybody hears about the Arba Kosas is the idea mentioned by Rashi, that in actual fact, there are what are called Arba Lashonos Geula. There are four expressions of redemption in the pasuk. These are four different, seemingly synonyms, but they're not really synonyms. They're actually describing stages. They're not different descriptions of the Geula. They were four stages of the Geula, as I want to explain to you now. And I want to show you how these, I want to go a little bit deeper. I want to dig a little bit deeper into this idea of the four expressions of Geula and show you that these expressions are connected in a very interesting way to another pasuk that we have in the Haggadah. There's one paragraph in the Haggadah which starts with the words Baruch Shomer Havtacha Havtachaso LeYisrael Baruch Hu. We're thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for the promise and for the keeping of that promise. Which promise are we referring to? This is the promise given to Avraham Avinu in Parshas Lech Lecha at the Bris Bein HaBesarim. Let's have a closer look at that for a moment in the text. Yeah, this is a pasuk which we quote in our Haggadah. Vayomer Avram. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Avraham Avinu, Yodoa Teda, you must surely know, Ki ger yazarcha be'eretz lo lohem, your children will be strangers in a land which is not theirs. In other words, they will feel that they are visitors in somebody else's land. Va'avodum, and they will be enslaved. Ve'inu osam, and they will be persecuted. Arba me'as shana, for 400 years. So Avraham Avinu is given this bad news that even though he's promised to inherit the land of Israel, he's told that the route towards living in the land of Israel, Klal Yisrael will have to go through these difficult circumstances of golus, slavery, and persecution. How do we reckon 400 years? So Rashi already tells us that the 400 years are Misha Nolad Yitzchak. From the moment Yitzchak was born, actually Yatzu Mitzrayim was 400 years, because Yitzchak was 60. Rashi gives us a cheshbon here. Yitzchak was 60 when Yaakov was born, as we know in the pasuk. And Yaakov, when he came down to Egypt, he says he's 130. So it's 190 years from the birth of Yitzchak to the time that Yaakov arrives with his family in Egypt. And then it says, "Over Mitzrayim hayu mosayim ve'eser." In Egypt, they were all 210 years. Harei arba me'as shana. Okay, so we have here a very interesting. So this is, if you like, the earliest source for the whole of Golus Mitzrayim is in Parshas Lech Lecha with Avraham Avinu. As I mentioned a few times in other shiurim, in actual fact, Sefer Bereshis, the whole book of Bereshis, contains within it the shoresh, the roots of all the important events that will happen to Klal Yisrael throughout history. In other words, everything that will happen later on in history has its origins in Sefer Bereshis. If you like, in modern language, the book of Bereshis is the DNA of the whole Tanakh, and the whole future history of Klal Yisrael is all in Sefer Bereshis. And this is also true about both the Golus and the Yetzias Mitzrayim. What's interesting here is, I want to show you a correlation between this pasuk, right? Bear in mind that this pasuk says the Jewish people are going to go through three stages of Golus. The first is that is simply being strangers in somebody else's land. That's not necessarily a great suffering. That's not necessarily a persecution or a slavery. It's just being a guest in a host country, as indeed the Jewish people were probably for the most of Jewish history. But then the next stage is va'avodah. The next stage is that they will be enslaved. They won't just be guests in a foreign country. They will be enslaved. And then the third most intense word here is ve'inu osa. They will be persecuted. They will be suffering, right? So in other words, these are three stages getting deeper and deeper into the suffering of Golus Mitzrayim as HaKadosh Baruch Hu predicts to Avraham Avinu. Compare this to this pasuk. And I'm learning with you this pasuk because this is the pasuk on which is based the Arba Kosas, the 4 cups of wine. So here we have underlined here, these are the opening psukim of Parshas Va'era, that these are I've underlined the 4 words which Chazal referred to as the Arba Lishonot Geula, 4 different expressions, or if you like, stages of redemption. But what's interesting is if you follow the stages, you'll find that they are, in fact, these exactly the 3 stages mentioned to Avraham Avinu in reverse order. Let me show you what I mean. So the first level of redemption is to be redeemed from the Sivlos Mitzrayim. Sivlos means sevel, means suffering. In other words, the first part of the Geula was that there was no longer any suffering. And according to Chazal, as soon as the 10 plagues began, that was already stage 1 of the Geula. They were still strangers in a strange land, and they were still being enslaved, but they were no longer being persecuted by the Egyptians. The second stage was the Tzalti Eschem Me Avodasam, that I will save you from their from slavery. Right, that was the second level of Golus. Right, they're being redeemed from the slavery, and the third level is V'go'alti Eschem Bizroa Natuyo B'shvatim Gedolim, and that's already the 10 plagues and Kriyas Yamsuf. That is already the taking them out of being strangers in a strange land. So in reverse order, whereas going in, it was first being a stranger, and then slavery, and then suffering. Coming out, it was first removing the suffering, then the slavery. And then, but what's interesting is the parallelism between that pasuk in Lech Lecha and this pasuk in Va'era. And then once all, and the first, so these first three expressions are all, if you like, removing of the negative. And then this word, velokachti, which is the 4th cup of wine, which is the 4th expression, that's already not removing the negative, but that's already velokachtem eschem li la'am, I will take you to me as a people, which is a reference to Har Sinai. Right? So what you have here is 4 stages of the Geula of Klal Yisrael coming out of Mitzrayim to Har Sinai in these 4 different words, which really is the, if you like, the antidote. In a sense, this pasuk is an antidote to the other pasuk, which is also in the Haggadah, as I mentioned to you. And this pasuk here in the Haggadah is describing the Golus itself and how Avram is told that the Golus is predicted. Okay, so that is really, I think, the first level of meaning that we can find in the Arba Kosas, in the 4 cups of wine. Now, what I'd like to show you now are 2 other very important and beautiful commentaries on the Arba Kosas, and then we'll develop the theme a little bit more. So here we have a Gemara in Brachos, and the Gemara reads as follows. If you can see this inside, right? The Gemara says, Amar Yehuda Marav, Arba Tzarichim Lahodos. There are 4 different categories of people who needs to bring a korban toida, a thanksgiving offering. In other words, people who were in hazardous situations where they could have lost their life, but HaKadosh Baruch Hu saved them and protected them, and therefore they need to bring a korban toda. So this really is referring to, at the time of the Beis HaMikdash, bringing thanksgiving offerings. But actually, this has a very important halachic implication as well. This is the origin of what we call benching gomer. Who are the people who, there's a special bracha, gomer l'chayovim teves, shegmalani kol tev, a bracha that one makes, you get an aliyah. When do you make this bracha? So the answer is, Rabbi Yehuda Marav, there are 4 different categories of people who need to thank HaKadosh Baruch Hu for having saved their lives. What are they? So here are the 4 categories in the Gemara. Okay, some of these categories. So the first one is Yoredei Hayam. So Yoredei Hayam means people who go on a seafaring journey. They go in a boat. In earlier times, traveling by boat was very hazardous. If you were caught in a storm or in a gale or whatever it is, the boat went down without leaving a trace. There was no. So if you had a boat journey and you were saved from it, that's Yoredei Hayam. You went through the sea. The second one is Holchei Midbaros, people who travel through the Midbar, through the desert. Also, while they're in the desert, they can't survive. They're relying on the water and food they've taken with them, and their lives are in danger. The third one is Misha Hoya Cholev and Israper, somebody who was seriously ill and recovered. That's the third category. And the fourth category is Misha Hoya Chovush Beis HaSurim B'Yotz, somebody who was imprisoned and came out of prison. Particularly in earlier times, maybe nowadays with civil rights and prisoners associations, it's not quite like that anymore, but certainly in earlier times, somebody who went into prison was unlikely to come out alive. Going into prison was a death sentence usually. You didn't usually survive either the starvation or the illness or the brutality of the other prisoners or the guards. Being in prison was something which was the end of your life, more often than not. And therefore, if you came out and you were okay, you benched gomer. These are the 4 categories of benching, of saying gomer. And so that's the Gemara in Yuma. So here we have an interesting forgot. Excuse me just 1 second, Rabbi. I just want to just playing with this screen for a little bit, for 1 minute. So the Gemara, why is this Gemara in Yuma interesting? Because the Vilna Gaon, when he was explaining the Haggadah, it's a famous idea brought in by the Vilna Gaon on the Haggadah, he says that the Klalius, that this piece of Gemara is based on Leil Seder and Yetzias Mitzrayim. And in actual fact, Klal Yisrael, when they came out of Mitzrayim, they went through all these 4 different stages. They went through the sea, they were Yoredei Hayam. They went through the Midbar, they went through the deserts, right? They were Cholesh and Isrape. They were surrounded by plagues and illnesses of the 10 plagues, and they survived it. And they were Yotzei Beis HaSurim. They escaped Egypt, which was one big jail for them. In other words, they escaped into freedom. All these 4 categories, says the Vilna Gaon, were experienced by the Jewish people at Yetzias Mitzrayim, and therefore, he says, we drink arba kosas. The 4 cups of wine represent 4 different moments of hakaras hatov, of gratitude to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he saved us from the prison of Egypt, from the illnesses of Egypt, from the plagues, from the sea, and from drowning in the sea, and from starving in the desert. All these different aspects of Hatzalah, of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, these are, that's why we have Arba Kosas, says the Vilna Gaon. Okay, so far we've had 2 explanations of the Arba Kosas. One is the 4 expressions of Geula, which corresponds to the stages of the prophecy to Avraham Avinu. And the second is the 4 types of people who need to give special thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch. But here comes my favorite. Now, you're now going to get my favorite Perush, which is something which maybe some of you who've heard my Divrei Torah at Ner Yisrael in earlier years probably heard me mention, but it bears repeating. And incidentally, Seder night is a night of repeating ideas which maybe everybody's heard before. Even if we know it all, nevertheless, it's a mitzvah to say it over, because by saying it over, you're internalizing it and you're communicating it to other people. So you don't have to worry on Seder night to say over ideas you said last year or the year before. But this is one of my favorite ideas. And this comes from the writings of the Shloh HaKodesh. The Shloh HaKodesh was one of the greatest Mekubolim in Europe in the 17th century. His name was Rabbi Shaya Halevi Horovitz, and he's known as the Shloh because he wrote a sefer called the Shnei Luchot Habrit, Shin Lamed Hey, Shnei Luchot Habrit. That's the name of his sefer, and it also contains within it a bit of an acronym of his name. Yeshaya Halevi Horovitz is the Shin Lamed Hey in the book. So he's known as the Shloh HaKodesh. On the 4 cups, he says something very beautiful. He says that on Seder night, and here's something I want to develop now this theme a little bit. On Seder night, we're actually, of course, the goal of Leil Seder is to speak about the events and the moments of the creation of Am Yisrael. Now, the nation of Klal Yisrael were created at Yetzias Mitzrayim. That was the creation of the nation. Before that, we were the children of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, but we hadn't been consolidated into Am Yisrael. It was only when they all joined together and followed Moshe Rabbeinu to Har Sinai, we became Am Yisrael. However, at the same time, what we need to do is recognize our origins, and our origin are the Ovois and the Imohos of Klal Yisrael. Says the Shloh HaKodesh, the 4 cups of wine are the Arba Imohos, the 4 mothers of Klal Yisrael, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah, right? What they invested into all subsequent generations, their emunah and their midas and their yirah shamayim and their chesed and all their wonderful qualities that they invested in all future generations. That's what we're celebrating with these Arba kosas. And each time you raise one of these kosas, you should have in mind one of the imohos, one of the Arba imohos. And he goes on, the Shloh HaKodesh goes on to link up beautifully each one of the Arba imohos with a particular stage of Seder night when we raise the cup. And I'm just going to go through this a bit quickly, otherwise we can spend the whole shiur on it, but it's very beautiful and it's very profound. And I would suggest to everybody that before you drink each cup of wine, you speak about the significance of this kos yain. Why is this kos yain important? What that means is even before you start the whole evening, because the first thing you're going to do is Kiddush, before you make Kiddush, you say, right, this Kiddush is different to all the Kiddush of every Shabbos and Yom Tov the whole year round, because everyone has their own kos, and everybody has to drink their own cup of wine at the end of the Kiddush, and you have to have in mind what the significance of the kos is. So on one level, the first kos is V'hotzeisi, is the beginning of the 4 Lashonos Geula. On another level, it's one of the stages of benching Gomel. But on top of that, says the Shloh, the first kos is the cup of Sorah Imein. And actually, when I run my Seder night, I give out some jobs to children and grandchildren who I know are going to be at the table, and I tell them in advance, I've got a homework for you. We're going to speak about Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah. You're going to prepare a 2-minute Dvar Torah on Sarah, and you're going to prepare something on Rivka, and you're going to prepare something on Rachel and Leah, and then they've got their moment to shine. To the beginning of the evening, we are celebrating Sarah Imenu. Why is Sarah particularly connected to Kiddush? And the answer is straightforward, because the Kiddush starts off with the words, Asher bochar banu mikol om, that we were chosen by HaKadosh Baruch Hu from all other nations of the world. When were we chosen? The answer is Avram and Sarah. And Sarah is a crucial player in the chosenness of Klal Yisrael. Right? That process began with Avram and Sarah. So Sarah is the founder of Klal Yisrael, and we're raising a case, right, for to commemorate the power of Sarah. Incidentally, the Shlo also says, it takes us a bit further afield, won't go into it now. Why do we use a cup of wine to commemorate the Imahos? Because of the pasuk in the Tehillim, Eshtecha kegefen poriyah. Eshtecha kegefen poriyah. The Yakazeh Beiseh, which compares the woman of the house to a fruitful vine, and to the wine. The wine is connected to the Eishes Chayil, the woman of the home, and therefore we use Arba koses for the Arba Imahos. Moving on, what is the second kos? So the second kos we drink at the end of the whole story of Magid, right? We go through the whole of the Haggadah, and then we say the Brach Hashem Galon of Galas Havasenu, and then we drink the second kos. Says the Shla, that's Rivka. Why is that Rivka? So this relates a little bit to the point I made just before in general about Seder night, and that is Rivka represents, if you like, the classic Balas Tshuva, who has grown up surrounded by the paganism and the corruption and the deviousness of Lavan and Besuel, and she has chosen a life of Emunah and Chesed. So she has negated all her environment and chosen a path of MS, right? And that's Rivka. And that is really the story of Klal Yisrael, that we were surrounded for 210 years, surrounded by the corruption and materialism and paganism of Egypt, and we preserved our emunah. That when Moshe Rabbeinu called us to follow him, Lechtech Achrei Bamidbar to Har Sinai, Klal Yisrael responded. And why did they do so? Because they were able to maintain their emunah in impossible circumstances. And that is Rivka. What is Rachel? So Rachel is connected to the third cup, which is Birkas Hamazon. Why is Rachel connected to Birkas Hamazon? Is because Rachel's firstborn, Yosef, right, is the man who kept the whole of the Egyptian nation and the whole of the Jewish people from starvation. He was Hu HaMashbir, says the Pasuk. Hu HaMashbir, Yosef Hu HaMashbir. He is the source of sustenance for the whole nation, both the Jewish nation and the Egyptian nation, right, in times of great famine. And therefore, Rachel is connected dafka to Birkas Hamazon, where we're thanking HaKadosh Baruch Hu for providing sustenance for us, and therefore we recollect the greatest provider of sustenance in the entire Chumash, and that is Yosef, and that connects us to Rachel Imenu, to his mother Rachel. And then the last case is Hallel. And Hallel is pure thanksgiving. And Leah, more than any of the other imahos, is the one person who names her son Yehuda, Hapam Oide Es Hashem. She is the one who explicitly gives Hoda'ah and thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and therefore Hallel is particularly appropriate to Leah. So here you have something quite amazing. You have here, during the course of Seder night, it's an important dimension of the whole of Yetzias Mitzrayim to connect to the imahos. And here comes an interest. So that's another point which is worth remembering and developing on your Leil Seder. But let's connect that for a minute with the fact that in addition to the Arba Kosas, what we have on our Seder plate is we have 3 matzahs. Why do we have 3 matzahs on Seder night when every other Shabbos and Yom Tov the whole year round we have 2 loaves of bread, not 3, and suddenly on Seder night we have 3? Why is that? Okay, so there is a halachic reason for it, And the halachic reason is that we want to make motzi on two shleimim, on two matzahs which are complete. But before we make hamotzi, we do yachatz, we break one of them in half. So one of them is broken. So in order to be left with two complete matzahs, we start off the evening with 3 matzahs. The middle one is broken and half is put away for the afikomen for later on. And that's why we have 3 matzahs. But says the Shla HaKadosh, it's not so simple. In other words, every minhag that we have, which is based on halachic reasons, also has a deeper, mystical, symbolic meaning to it. Says the Shla HaKadosh, if the Arba Kosas, if the 4 cups reflect the Arba Imohos, the 4 matriarchs, then the 3 matzahs represent the Shlosha Ovos. So you have Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are the 3 matzahs, and Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, and Leah are the Arba Kosas. And this is a very important part of Seder night, to be able to connect to our origins of the Ovos and the Imohos. In addition, so there are really different stories to tell on Seder night. So I want you to hold that thought for a minute, and I want you to have a look with me at another text. Okay, so when we learn the Mishnah and the Gemara in the last chapter of Pesachim, we come across the if you like, the fundamental pattern of the Haggadah. We haven't actually got the text of the Haggadah until about the 8th or 9th century was there a standardized text written by the time of the Gaonim. By the time of the Gemara, we already have the basic ideas of the Haggadah. So here you have, for example, Mozgalo Kos Sheni, when you pour the second cup, you fill the second cup, you've made Kiddush already, V'kan ben Shoel, and the child asks the question, and what does he ask? Manishtana halayla zeh mikol halaylos, etc., etc., etc. Okay, this is the manishtana that we say on Seder night is in fact a Mishnah with one slight change, and that is in the Mishnah. And the manishtana starts here, right? In the Mishnah, we have one of the questions relates to the meat of the Korban Pesach, which we don't have. So we skip that question, and instead of which we put in Kulona Masubit. That's not what I'm looking at the moment. What happens after the child has asked the questions, or if there's no child, somebody has asked the questions? So there, the Mishnah, this also, we're still in the Mishnah. And the answer is, well, then you have to teach him the answer. What is the answer to the Manishtana? And here comes the 4 words I want to focus on. These 4 words in the Mishnah are a subject of quite a lot of analysis and discussion. The Mishnah here says, look at these 4 words, matchil begenus u'masayim b'shvach. That you start with the genus. The genus means the sad part of the story, the shameful part of the story, the part of the story which is tragic, u'masayim b'shvach, and you end with the praiseworthy part of the story, a part of the story which is to be celebrated. So on a simple level, all the Mishnah here is really saying is, you think that Seder night is about recounting the Exodus, the Yetzias Mitzrayim, and how happy we are about the Geula. But before you can speak about the Geula, you have to speak about what preceded the Geula, the suffering and the slavery that they went through and the difficulties they went through. And it's only against the background, against the gestalt of their suffering, then you can appreciate the simcha of Yetzias Mitzrayim. So that's what it means. Matchil b'genus or Masayim b'sheva. That's what you've got to say. But what are you supposed to say? So here comes an interesting thing. Here later on, the Gemara is analyzing the Mishnah. So the Gemara takes this phrase, Matchil b'genus or Masayim b'sheva, and asks a question, my b'genus. What is the author of the Mishnah referring to when he speaks about the part of the story which is shameful or negative. In other words, we know what the happy part of the story is. The happy part of the story is that they got out of Mitzrayim, went through the Yam Suf, and the creation of Klal Yisrael. But what do you mean by Gemus? And here you have in the Gemara a difference of opinion, a debate between Rav and Shmuel. Just a little bit of a historical footnote here. So Rav and Shmuel is the very, very beginning of the period of the Gemara, right? Until the time of Rav and Shmuel is the period of the Mishnah. The Mishnah, of course, took place and was written and edited in Israel. And that's why the Mishnah is in Hebrew. But the Gemara isn't in Hebrew. The reason why the Gemara isn't in Hebrew is because it's Talmud Bavli. It was written in Bavel. And these two men, Rav and Shmuel, were the two great spiritual and communal leaders of the Jewish people in the 3rd century in Bavel, right? Shmuel was the Rosh Yeshiva in a town called Nehar Dor, and Rav was the Rosh Yeshiva in a town called Sura. And Sura and Nehar Dor were the two centers of Torah for many, many centuries. I haven't got an exact historical fix on that, but I would say close to 800 years, Torah was learnt and taught and developed and written down in these centers in Bavel, up to and including the time of the Gaonim, right, in the 9th century. So Rav and Shmuel were the two great leaders of their generation. So that's the historical footnote. But what do they say here? Let's have a look at the text. Rav says, the story doesn't begin in Egypt. The story doesn't begin with slavery. The story begins much earlier than that. So Rav says, in the beginning, our ancestors were pagans. And in fact, this phrase, as we know, is in our Haggadah. I just brought you here. This is the paragraph from our Haggadah. This is the Haggadah. I've written here the version of Rav. In the beginning, our ancestors were pagans, and now HaKadosh Baruch has brought us close to his service, and he brings a pasuk, right? The pasuk from Shiur, chapter 24, right? When the pasuk says, over the river your ancestors dwelt always, Terach, the father of Ram, the father of Nahar, and they worshipped other gods. And what happened? And the pasuk says, and I took Avram Avinu and brought him out and brought him into Egypt and eventually into Eretz Yisrael. But what's interesting is, and this is what I want to just focus on for a minute, and something worth highlighting on the Leil Seder, that actually Rab is telling us something very important. It's true that on a simple level, the narrative of Leil Seder begins with Avodim Hoyinu Lefarab Mitzrayim, we were slaves in Egypt, and then 10 plagues and Yetzias Mitzrayim and the creation of Am Yisrael. That is true on a national level. But on a personal level, the journey that we are commemorating on Leil Seder isn't a journey from Avdus Lecheirus, it's a journey from Avodah Zarah to Emunah. It's a spiritual journey from a world of atheism and materialism and paganism into a world of Avodas Hashem. That's the real journey that Klal Yisrael have made from the very beginning and continue to make ad hayom hazeh. To this day, the important journey in a person's life is to travel away from the paganism and the materialism and the atheism of the world around us, and to travel into a world of emunah and thanksgiving to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Rav comes along and so Shmuel says that the story, what does it mean? Matchil b'genus and Masayim b'shevach. The story is we were slaves and we were freed. Let's celebrate. And that's terrific. But Rav says that's only half the story. The other half of the story is that we journeyed away. It was a spiritual odyssey, a spiritual journey away from atheism and paganism towards a belief, a life of emunah and chesed. That's really what we're celebrating on Leil Seder. And you can't, and what do we do, actually? The text that we say in the Haggadah is we weave together both Rav and Shmuel into our Haggadah. But it's important while we're saying it, maybe to draw people's attention to the fact that these are in fact two different narratives. They're two different stories. One is getting rid of slavery and becoming free, but freedom in and of itself, just free to do what you like, is no great achievement from a Torah point of view. It's freedom to live a life of Avodat Hashem, to live a life of meaning and purpose, and to be close to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That is the great achievement of Leil Seder. What I often say also is important, and maybe I mentioned at this point, it's important to, in some way, take the story of the Haggadah, everybody who is participating in a Seder night, and personalize it. What do I mean by personalize it? I mean that if you've got a story in your family of a parent or grandparent or great-grandparent or an uncle or friend, somebody who went through a journey, either a journey me'avdus l'chairus, from poverty and persecution to freedom, or somebody who came from an environment of atheism and materialism and found their way into Torah, that is a story to tell on Seder night. And if you or any of your guests have a story like that to tell, that's the story to tell. When we read the Haggadah, this is actually the story of every Baal Tshuva. Everybody who's gone through the Tshuva process started off their life surrounded by atheism and materialism and found their way into a life of emunah and chesed. And that is really the tremendous message of Rav. Rav says, when we're learning the Mishnah, the process of Leil Seder is really a process of ruchnius, of discovering the emes, discovering the spiritual truth of a life of emunah and mitzvahs. That's really what it's about. And that was the moment of putting the blood on the doorpost, was the moment of the mitzvah. That was the mitzvah which actually was the turning point where everybody who put their blood on the doorpost was saying, I am disconnecting myself. I'm disengaging myself from the atheism and the corruption and the paganism of Egypt, and I want a new life. I want the life represented by Moshe Rabbi. So here we have, I think, a very beautiful and interesting double narrative in the Gemara. I'll just go back to that for 1 second. So Rav said that the main narrative is the spiritual journey from Avodah Zarah to Avodas Hashem, and Shmuel said the main narrative is Avodim Hayinu. That's the main narrative. And what do? We do both. Just have a quick look at the commentary of the Rambam on the Mishnah. So the Rambam writes, Mozgulu kos sheini v'kana ben shoel ovid, matzil b'gnus. What does it mean? So he says, look at the language of the Rambam, I always find very beautiful. Hushi yasaper eichoyinu kodem Avram Avinu. Pre-Avram Avinu, who were we? We were kafrim. We were people who denied the existence of God, of Odi Gelulim, and actively involved in paganism. Umishtatfim Hashem Yisparach. Right? And we combined God with other idols. And then afterwards, Bachabonu Hashem Yisparach. HaKadosh Baruch Hu chose us, and as I said before, he chose us and we chose him, and that is the story of Rav. And then says the Rambam, and on top of that, we also say, all the suffering we endured in Egypt, etc., etc. So this is, I think, a very interesting dimension to Leil Seder. And what I want to do is connect this with the idea of the Avos and the Imahos. So you can say on Seder night, the reason we have 4 cups of wine and 3 matzahs is because we are connecting ourselves to the Arba Imohos and the Shlosha Ovos, the 3 patriarchs and the 4 matriarchs, because that's where the story began, because they made the move out of the world of materialism and atheism into the world of Emunah, and only because of that was Yetzias Mitzrayim possible. I'd like to also just so that is a point which I think is very beautiful and which is connected to the wine and the matzah. But I'd like to add to that another level of meaning, which is found also in many of the writings of the Gedolei HaChasidus. Many of the great Hasidic writers look at the wine and the matzahs in a very interesting symbolic way. I've seen this in Rav Tzadok HaKohen of Lublin and the Shem Mishmur of Sokachov and several other Perushim. I want to give you a little bit of a taste of just something a bit more, if you like, conceptual, which is going on behind the scenes here. Don't forget, all Divrei Torah are multi-layered. There's Pshat, Remez, Drush, and Seid, all different levels of meaning, which are all equally true. They're just looking at it from a deeper point of view. So what is the Seid here? The Seid here is that within Klal Yisrael and within every human being, every member of every man or woman in Klal Yisrael, there are 2 different ways to connect to our Jewish life. And these 2 different ways are generally referred to as the moyach and the leiv. The moyach is the intellect, the understanding, the conceptual and textual learning of Judaism, which is the brain. Some people connect through the brain. And then there is the leiv. The leiv is the passion, the feeling, the emotion, the intuition, the moyach and the leiv. In modern terminology, you might want to say, this is Rabbi Sachs often mentions, that in modern terminology, the moyach and the leiv are really the right-hand side of the brain and the left-hand side of the brain, right? Where the left-hand side of the brain medically has been shown to deal with logic and mathematics and science and texts and facts, and is very analytic. And the right-hand side of the brain deals with emotions and music and relationships, and deals with what used to be called the leiv, is more the right-hand side of the brain. And then there are lots of people who are more on one side than on the other side. The goal in life really is to find a balance between both the logic and the text on the one hand, and the emotion and the motivation on the other hand. But the moyach and the leiv, say the Gedolei HaChasidus, are represented by the wine and the matzah. The matzah, which is white flour, right? So that represents the moyach, meaning the white is the clarity of the brain to understand the emes, and the wine is the red, which is the leiv, which is the passion, which is the blood, if you like, which is the driving force of Klal Yisrael. So the driving force is in the heart, but the moyach gives it a conceptual and intellectual depth. And the combination between the moyach and the leiv is a combination between the wine and the matzahs. And this is why during the course of the meal, we are sometimes going to raise the kos when we are emphasizing the more, if you like, passionate part of the story. And sometimes we're going to raise the matzah when we're emphasizing more of the intellectual or conceptual part of the story. I haven't got time to go into the whole Seder night, but pay attention during the Seder night. The matzah and the wine are meant to complement each other. And this is a general theme between the white and the red that we find in many places. It's actually based on a pasuk in Shir Hashirim, where the pasuk says, "Doidi tzach va'odoi." My beloved, this is Klal Yisrael speaking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, my beloved is white and red. What does it mean, white and red? Which means I connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu through my brain and my understanding, but also through my emotions and intuition and through my sense of relationships. These are the two different ways that we connect. Symbolically, if you like, this is connected also to the idea I mentioned earlier, that the wine represents the imohos. The power of the women was more connected to the leiv. The women were the heart of Klal Yisrael, the passion, the driving, the motivation, the depth of feeling, and the leiv, and the intuition, right, the right-hand side of the brain, whereas the men represented more the matzah, which is the moyach, which is the intellectual learning and analysis and understanding, and therefore the wine and the matzah represent at one level the ovos and the mohos. On a deeper level, they represent the moyach and the leiv of Klal Yisrael. And that's really our goal on Seder night, to find a balance between the moyach and the leiv, to be able to understand both with our mind and intuitively with our passion the way we can connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to hand that over to the next generation, to hand that over to our guests, to hand that over to each other, and each year to emphasize again and again the beauty of that moment. I've still got a couple of minutes left. I want to share with you a very beautiful idea which connects some of the issues we've been talking about. And this is an interesting moment in Seder night, which is yachatz, breaking the matzah in half. What are we doing when we're breaking the matzah in half? Why do we break it in half and put half away? So, again, we have to look everything on pshat, remez, drush, and soid, on all these different levels. Why are we doing it? So the pshat is, the simple meaning is, right, what I said to you in the first shiur, is that there are two mitzvahs of eating matzah. One is the first kazayas, and one is the last kazayas. So you take one of these matzahs, break it in half. One bit you're going to eat at the beginning of the meal, and the other bit you're putting away for the end of the meal. Because you want, from the very beginning, you want to make it clear that the matzah has got two halves to it, and what these two halves represent. That is the simple meaning. On a deeper level, we're breaking the matzah in half. The Gemara says, because the pasuk in Devarim, Shivas Yomei Matzos Tachelu Lechem Oni, speaks about the matzah as lechem oni, the bread of a poor man, and the Gemara in Pesachim says, Ma oni b'prusa of matzah b'prusa. In other words, an oni doesn't usually have a whole loaf of bread. He has only half a loaf of bread. Having a half on the table is part of the symbolism of anius, of poverty. Okay. But here there is a very interesting story, which is brought down in the Gemara in Shabbos, Daf Peites. I have the text here, but time is a bit short. I'm not going to go through all the text on the screen. I'll tell it to you Ba'al Peh. If you want to look it up, it's on Shabbos, Gemara Shabbos, Daf Peites. There the Gemara brings a few psukim from Yeshaya. And the implication is that Ba'acharis Hayomim, and the part of the messianic image is that HaKadosh Baruch Hu addresses the Ovos, speaks to the Ovos, and he asks them, what am I going to do with all those Klal Yisrael who have abandoned Judaism? What am I going to do with them? What am I going to do with all the Chilonim? What am I going to do with all those people who've got off the derech and they've lost their Judaism? What are we going to do with them now at the time of the Messianic period? What's going to happen to them? So Avram doesn't know what the answer is. Yaakov doesn't know what the answer is. He goes to a few other people. He goes to Yitzchak. And to Yitzchak, he says, this is all in the Gemara there. It's a midrashic conversation between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Yitzchak Avinu at the time of Mashiach. He says to him, Bonechu chotuli, Your children have sinned to me. What's going to be with them? So Yitzchak stands up. And Yitzchak comes up and he stands up as the Sanegor. He stands up as the counsel for the defense for the non-religious members of Klal Yisrael. And he says, what do you mean, Bonecha Chotuli? Bonai v'lei Bonecha? What, they're my children, they're not your children? They're your children as much as my children. Bani B'cheri Yisrael, you spoke about Klal Yisrael as your children, they're your children. And secondly, how much could they have sinned already? And then he goes through a whole real negotiation with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. He says, well, up to the age of 20, people are not really mature yet, they're not responsible for their deeds, so we'll discount that. So from 20 till 70, they've got 50 years. Half of that time is spent sleeping and eating, etc. The other time is spent earning the parnasa. He goes through a whole calculation about they can't have done so much Averas anyhow. And at the end, he says, this is the punchline. And the end, Yitzchak says, and indeed they have done some Averas. Here's my deal with you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Palga olai, upalga olecha. I take responsibility for half, and you take responsibility for half. We'll share it. We'll share the load. A real counsel for the defense. We'll share the load. I take responsibility for half of all the Averas that Klal Yisrael have done all the generations. And guess what? I've already paid my half because I gave up my life at the Akedah. So I've already paid my half. You've got to pay the other half. And together we will find a way to forgive them. But what's amazing is this one line that Yitzchak says, half is on me and half is on you, and that's how we are going to save Klal Yisrael, even those who are very distant from Torah and mitzvahs. Right? Why is that interesting? Because what do we do on Seder night? If we've got 3 matzahs, and the 3 matzahs are Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, what do? We take the middle matzah, which is Yitzchak, and we break it in half. And we say half is for us, and half we're giving to you, half we're putting away. You, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, have to help us find a way to bring the whole of Klal Yisrael together and to bring back people who have abandoned Yiddishkeit. And I think this is a very beautiful perush on the text, on the mitzvah of Yachatz, breaking the matzah in half. So on one level, it's simply a question of reminding ourselves there are 2 mitzvahs of eating matzah, but on a deeper level, it relates to the unity of Klal Yisrael through the mouth of Yitzchak Avinu, who stands up and is the counsel for the defense for Klal Yisrael. That's it for this evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very nice to see you all. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've managed to. I've got a text, if you like. I'll send the text to Sarah or to Graham. Anybody who's interested in can get hold of the text that I was using for the Shiur, which includes the text of this last story of Yitzchak saying half on me and half on you. And that's it for this evening. So next Sunday, we're doing the last of the series of 4. Is that right?
Yes.
The last of the series of 4 is next Sunday. That's it for this evening. Very nice to see you all. I'm always pleased to get together and learn together. And thank you once again, Graham and Belinda, for the idea of running this course.
Okay. If there are any questions, Robert Kimche will be pleased to answer.
If there's anybody who wants to make a remark or raise any issues, I can still stay online for a few minutes if you like.
Yeah, I had a question.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you very much for the share. I was wondering, in relation to the intellect and the heart,
yes,
is one meant to dominate? And then I thought, well, is it, given that the matzah, there's 3 of them, and the wine is 4, does that mean that the lave is meant to dominate in some way? Then I thought, based on what you just said, that possibly, I don't know, the Yachatz then makes it into 4 Matzot. I don't know if there's anything in that.
Right, right.
I was wondering if there was some way in which, like, there is meant to be some balance.
Right. Okay, it's a big question, that. That's not a simple question. There's no simple answer to that. We're dealing with the very profound issues of human nature and human motivation. But certainly the main idea here isn't the one dominates. The main idea here is that there's a balance between, they work together hand in hand, that the matzos and the wine are really just two sides of a coin, right? And then in a sense, by representing the ovos and the imahos, the idea is to work together, b'sholem, to work together in unity. Are you following me? It's the unity between the emotion and the intellect, which is the key. But there's sometimes when the emotion is dominant. In the writings of Chazal, we find the following idea. I'll just present you with this idea that really the two major, if you like, mitzvahs that we do, which connect us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, of course, every mitzvah connects us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But the two major ones are davening and learning Torah. And the learning Torah is the moyach, and the davening is the leiv. And the combination between learning and davening in practice is the combination between the leiv and the moyach, right? You have to daven in order to get your kavonas haleiv, right? Chazal, when they speak about davening, they speak about kavonas haleiv. But when you're learning, you're using your moyach, you're using your intellect. So using your intellect and using your leiv in an integrated way is clearly the goal. Exactly how that works in greater detail, maybe a subject for another shiur. But it's a nice point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, nice to see you all. And please God, we'll continue again next week. All the best.
Thank you very
Thanks
much.
again.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Thank you very much. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.